today we will have our first seminar series, and we are honored to have a new scholar with us. We welcome her, Dr. Yasemin Saib. She joined this semester our center. She is now residence research fellow, and also she is lecturing at Saib University. She earned her PhD in Islamic Studies from different universities. She has different degrees from different universities in Islamic Study and Geology. So we are looking forward for this talk. You will have 40 minutes. The talk, as you all know, that it's understanding the fiqh of reality or fiqh al-waqa in Arabic and its modern implication.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. Assalamu alaikum. Blessings of God be upon you. So thank you so much, first of all, to Dr. Saib and to the entire student team for hosting me today. Inshallah, in the next 40 minutes or so, hopefully I'll be able to impart some information that I hope will be useful in your either daily lives or in your academic work, or in your outlook, to be honest, on your faith as you practice it. So, because the subject that I picked, I feel it has been talked and discussed by many scholars, Ibn al-Qayyim, Qaradawi, Hassan al-Banna, most recently Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya have written about it, books and articles, and so it has been discussed, but it's not mainstream knowledge, I could say. Before I delve into the subject, I just wanted to quickly note its relevance to my personal interest, which is adoption. I did my PhD in Islamic law, and I focused on the legality of adoption in Islam, primarily because I've been an advocate for orphans for the past 20 plus years, and I find it, as the Quran and the Sunnah teaches us, that it's an important mandate. And if I had a dime for every time I've met a scholar who said, oh, no, adoption is haram in Islam, I'd be a very rich woman today. And, it's interesting to me where those concepts come from, why certain people say what they do. It's, the Prophet Muhammad adopted Zayd ibn Harith, and we, just like we have our own rules, to me it's so clear, we have our own rules for marriage, so do we have our own rules for adoption. We can't negate the word just because it doesn't apply to Western definitions, so we just have to redefine it based on our own standards. And so that took me on this journey. But more importantly, and how it's relevant to today's subject, is because this idea of applying jurisprudence or legal thought in today's world has consequences. So if I take a ruling of, for example, what adoption was 1,400 years ago and try to apply it into the concept of a nation state, it obviously would not work. So we have to have new definitions and new parameters and new understandings of how you can take care of a child in 2020 as opposed to how you took care of an orphan in 1,500 years ago. So this concept of al-fiqh al-waqi', the jurisprudence of reality, literally touches upon every subject. Within the context of today's subject, political science, international relations is definitely highly relevant to this center as well. So we'll just go through that inshallah. And please, I don't know if you want to interrupt me, and do we want to make it, or should we just finish and then address it however you like to? No problem, however you like. Okay. So what is jurisprudence of reality? It basically looks at how we how we come up with legal rulings. And it responds to the attempt of those who try to apply the jurisprudence of the past to the circumstances of today, taking laws from the past and applying it today. And this is the jurisprudence of reality. Basically, is a science that came out to respond to this particular problem. So it asks the questions, what is the basis of these rulings? Do these rulings depend on legal tradition, deriving of rulings, or are they branches? Are they sound? Are they unsound? Do they take into consideration universal understandings of these rulings? Is it the law, or is it the spirit of the law? Do these apply to to our life today, or can we say that they are somehow categorically incompatible? Some of the rulings today are not applicable, and new rulings need to come about. So it's obviously a very intensely deep subject, and unless you're interested in Islamic law, I apologize if this subject is could be dry. I'm very interested in Islamic law because I think that it can be a source of contention for a lot of people. So before we move forward, whenever a person is giving an Islamic or any really kind of discussion, first, in Arabic they say la khilafa fil mustalahat, which basically means there has to be, we have to agree on what the words mean. So in this regard, we're just going to talk about the defining of three particular words. The first one is fiqh, which is jurisprudence. What do we mean by that? Basically, it refers to human scholars' best attempt at interpreting divine guidance. Best attempt, because there are many verses in the Quran that says, and God will tell you what the truth is. So ultimately, we can only offer our best attempt as to what we believe, what Allah Subhanahu wa Taala is, what His divine guidance is for us. Sharia, which is of course a very common word that all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, is also a very important word because it relates to jurisprudence directly. So Sharia comes from the root Arabic word shara'a, which means way, the way to go, or pathway to be followed. The term originally was used to describe the path that leads to water, which inferred that it was the way to the source of life. Hence, Sharia and Islam, which Islam means, peace, it comes from sin, refers to God's immutable divine guidance through which one can achieve peace for themselves and for others. So for those, it's quite ironic that people assume that Sharia is somehow instigates violence, whereas it's the exact contrary by definition. So the third definition that's important for us, and this is the core of what we're going to talk about today, which is reality. Reality is really, we have to understand it in several different ways. What is reality? What is the effect of reality on legal rulings? And what are the consequences that arrive out of ignoring reality? So the reality, as you know, is not, the whole philosophers from around the world have talked about this concept of reality. There are many philosophers who have said, no, reality doesn't really exist, it's a figment of our imagination. Then there are those that, like Kant, for example, who said, no, reality definitely exists, but we can't really understand it with true clarity. In our tradition, Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali identifies reality in 4 different types, which is the mental existence, what we articulate with our tongues, what we compose in script, and the external existence that has real evidence, existence outside ourselves, which is wujud al-khariji. So we're going to really focus on the fourth one, which is the external existence, which is the real existence, because we can imagine things. and we're not really talking about that. Today's reality, by the way, metaphysical, Islamic philosophers talk about reality as well. I have a few friends who have their PhDs in metaphysics, and they talk about reality, wujud, haqiqa, all the time. That is definitely not the reality that we're talking about. Contextually, we're talking about physical, actual, tangible reality. It's not the metaphysical type, and it's not things that we're, that are in our imagination, because there are oftentimes, if we act on things that we imagine, we could obviously do harm, and that is really one of the major problems of society. We often have historical conceptualizations of what our world is that no longer exists today. How often have you attended a speech where it's stories from the from the Sahaba time, which are all very, very important and relevant, but lacking, right? Because there has so much has happened in the world since the last 1500 years that that requires us to respond to effectively. So for me to be able to have a thorough discussion, for us to be able to have a thorough discussion about what this jurisprudence of reality is, we really need to spend a little bit of time quickly going over Islamic law, because without it we can't really understand the jurisprudence of reality. And then I just want to say that I'm generally a very pragmatic, practical person. I don't just talk about theory, so we are going to talk about applications of the jurisprudence of reality later on in the discussion, so that at least you can have a sense of understanding of what the jurisprudence of reality actually means. So Islamic law, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this content, so we're just going to go through it very quickly. If you have any questions, we can discuss it, but let's consider it a refresher content. So there are three major goals to Islamic law, and every rule can be related to these matters, which is nurturing the righteous individual, establishing justice, and preserving and promoting these six matters: faith, life, family, prosperity, intellect, and dignity. Literally every ruling, every Islamic legal ruling falls into one of these categories, or at least is meant to fall into one of these categories. So how did Islamic law come into existence? Well, there is no exact sort of historical account where on this day this legal ruling this law has become codified. It didn't evolve that way, it evolved organically. Of course, it started with the Prophet ﷺ, and once he departed, he left with us the Quran, the Sunnah, and the Hadith. That was at the early times. It was basically passed down from his Sahaba to and his followers. His companions and the followers took what was approved as the model, and transmitted this information to succeeding generations. I'm obviously really oversimplifying here, just to kind of give us for me, timelines are very important because we're talking about present-day reality. So we need to start from the beginning to get us to where we need to go. These reports, became formalized, and then a systematic legal thought emerged, and jurists emerged out of this, and it was societally based, which is the next plot. As we all know, there are the four prominent prevailing schools of law: the Hanafi, the Maliki, the Shafi'i, and the Hanbali, and of course the Ja'fari. Now, we're not, every single one of these slides is a presentation on its own, is a doctoral dissertation on its own. So obviously we're just skimming the surface, but there's one thing I'd like to point out on this slide. All of these scholars, if you look at their early rulings and then look at their later rulings, there's a striking difference within just their own life as to how many times and how often they actually change their own rulings. Shafi'i, very notably, in his Al-Risala, he actually had almost like two shari'as. He had one in Baghdad, and then it changed drastically when he immigrated to Cairo, because he said that circumstances changed, society changed, time changed. Incidentally, the reality of Cairo was different than the reality of Baghdad. Now, they're actually noted that over 500 changes were done in Risala during his lifetime alone. Now, imagine if he had lived longer, perhaps he would have continued to change his rulings. And if there's one thing I also want to keep in mind, you know, we're talking from 699 to 855. It's roughly about 150 years. We're talking about scholars who came roughly from the same part of the world, Kufa, Medina, Baghdad, Qahira, etc. Right? So we're talking in a very short period of time. Some were students of the others in one part of the world, in the Arabian part of the world at a specific period of time. So there's nothing in the Quran and in the Sunnah that says there can only be 4 schools of jurisprudence, and all Muslims, all 1.7 billion Muslims on the world, have to follow these. I am not negating. I am a Hanafi. I've studied the Maliki school. A lot of my teachers are Malikis. I'm very much an adherent of traditional Islamic studies. But at the same time, we have to bear these things in mind. It's very important when we're talking about jurisprudence. We need to understand, what are we saying? Why are we saying I'm a Hanafi? Does that mean, and does that mean that whatever he said at his time is whatever we can live by in 2020? So these are the questions you really need to ask yourselves, because this applies to literally every aspect of your life. It applies to your own families, it applies to political science, it applies to economics, nation states, and everything else. You know, this is the Risala is a very good example of how the jurisprudence of reality was definitely applied in this scenario. So, again, this is just a refresher. How do jurists, how do Islamic law, and how does it come into about? What sources do they use? There is the revealed sources, which is the Quran and the Sunnah, and that encompasses biography, actions, teachings, sayings of the Prophet ﷺ, and the non-revealed sources. Now, these are not agreed upon by all of these. I just want to let you know. So some of them take istihsan and urf, and others don't. We don't need to get into the detail of who takes what. I just put all of them up here. This is in the Hanafi madhab, they take all of these considerations, and of course it's very complicated. For example, a Sunni hadith by itself cannot constitute a legal opinion. You can't use it and make it into law, for example. The same goes with, for example, you have to combine it with qiyas, you have to combine it with ijma', you have to combine it with something else for it to be able to stand on its own. So that's, for example, one idea. So sources of Islamic jurisprudence, this is what the general toolbox is to reach a certain ruling. You know, when people talk about, oh, well, what does the Sharia say about wudu? Do you have to, how it's tayammum, etc. Even in the smallest minutiae of details. These are you get the basic rules from this space, and of course the branches of the categories of law are basically it's the ibadat and mu'amalat. It's basically the rituals and the social relations. It really falls into these two categories, and the rulings assigned, it falls into any one of these compartmentalizations. It's either mandatory, necessary. Now necessary, this is only the Hanafi category. It doesn't exist in any of the other madhabs. I added it in there again because my studies, and in fact in my adoption, the legality of adoption in Islam, I made the legal case that actually where there is need, adoption is deemed a wajib. That was sort of my, in a nutshell, argument. But anyway, then there is the recommended, neutral, mubah, and then abhorred, makruh, and then the prohibited. Now, just one small little anecdote that you may not have considered is that has anybody here studied comparative religion? Are you familiar with like Judaism, for example? Okay, so you might know the interesting fact is that all of these fall under the halal, the permissible. Even the makruh falls under the permissible. It's not desired, but it's still permissible. Only haram falls under the prohibited. So actually, Islam is built on the foundation of what is permissible. So unless it's prohibited, the default state is permissible, is the permissibility, which is an exact contradiction to the Judaic studies, whereby unless it is explicitly permissible, the default state that is prohibited. So it's an interesting differentiation. All right, so early Muslim times, it's interesting to study, and of course, many books have been written about this. How Islamic law was practiced in the early days. It's absolutely fascinating how it was done. But the most important point to remember, it was decentralized. It was not codified that was, by nation states. Every tribe had its own sharia. Every tribe had its own muftis, author jurists, judges, and law professors. One offered the fatwa, the other one decided how it was applicable based on the circumstance. The judges ruled on it, and the law professors recorded it without the details, so that they can make it as a general rule of thumb. Oh, very good. All right, so basically, that's how it was implied. It was highly decentralized. It wasn't until the Ottoman Empire that the Qanun was actually, it basically created this legal code, and then so many other things happened. Colonialism really impacted, and we won't even get into all of that and how that really greatly impacted Islamic law in many of the Islamic lands. So then the emergence of ijtihad and taqlid came about, where there are many Islamic law scholars that said, we have sufficient knowledge, so this terminology of the closing of the gates of ijtihad, which I don't necessarily agree with. I think ijtihad has always occurred, but it's always been seen as a fringe. But really by the 10th century, the overwhelming majority, even today, we ask you what your madhab is, and you fall into a bracket. So ijtihad gradually became a lot more restricted. They're like, oh, well, the older generation, fuqaha, they already made those determinations, so therefore we should follow them. So this concept of ijtihad versus taqlid became a known struggle within this discourse. And but in the 18th century onward, there was a call for the abandonment of the taqlid and renewed ijtihad, and the reality of jurisprudence is really part of that new emergence. So the last bit of this part, just the refresher, is that there has been many, in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, modernist interpretations of Islamic law. These are fantastic. If you read Maqasid al-Sharia, it's a wonderful book. They'll actually go over the reformist interpretations, the apologetic interpretations, many different kinds of revisionism that has happened. So it's not like ijtihad has been closed, but again, they're generally deemed as the fringe, and they're not necessarily seen as mainstream methods. So, understanding the jurisprudence of reality, basically we live in a really interconnected world. An oil rig shuts down in one part of the world and affects the stock market in another part of the world. A financial crisis in New York or London, for instance, can have colossal global consequences. A civil war in one nation can have impact in other nations. So the reality of our situation is that we live in a highly interconnected world. It's like we're the one body. You know, one part of it gets sick, then the other parts of the body gets impacted. So this reality has an impact on Islamic legal rulings and also the human responsibilities that we have to fulfilling our duties. There's a hadith Hasan that goes إنكم في زمان من ترك فيه عشر ما أمر به هلك ثم يأتي زمان من عمل فيه بعشر ما أمر به نجا. It was reported by Al-Tirmidhi Al-Tabarani, among others, that it was narrated by Nu'aym ibn Hammad, that the Prophet, and I don't normally put all of these in front of the hadith, if it's Sahih or Muslim, but because this is a hadith Hasan, I felt it was necessary for me to overemphasize the narrators. Said that whoever leaves 1/10 of the teaching in this time, which is at that time, Prophet's time, they will perish. But later, there's coming in time, whoever fulfills only 1/10 of these teachings, they will succeed and have salvation. So it's a very interesting thing, for us to consider. At one time, you're saying that if you leave 1/10, you will perish, and there's going to be another time, if you actually apply 1/10, you will have salvation. It's a very thought-provoking hadith. So this hadith supports the argument that the time we live in impacts our duties and our expectations that God has over us. Yes, this is the complete hadith.
There is no details about it.
Oh no, this is not 10 things. The 1/10, يعني عشر. عشر. So reality changes rulings. With the changing of the times, so do rulings change, and the understandings and concepts change as well. So concept changes, what does that mean? We have to look at the questions. What, why, and how. What is the essence of something? Why, what is the reason behind it? Reasoning is extremely important. And how? What is the application of that essence? So we're gonna get into some examples. So, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya came up with his book during the time when the discussion in the media about jihad was, an hourly occurrence with a lot of turmoil, in the Middle East, and a lot of talk about jihad amongst the youth. So this was sort of, he addressed many things in his book, but jihad was one of the case studies. And it's a concept that I picked out that I feel that everybody's familiar with, so it's an easy thing for us to talk about. So, what is jihad? Why jihad? And how should jihad be practiced? So these are just some examples, of hadith and verses in the Quran. "Jahidhum bihi jihadan kabira," which basically means, do a big jihad with them. Actually, all ulama have agreed on the tafsir of this, which basically means informing them about the verses of the Quran. And this is Furqan 52. In the hadith, a boy came to the Rasul ﷺ and asked him permission to do jihad, and he said, "Are your parents alive?" He said, "Yes." He said, "And let your jihad be in taking care of them." So why do I mention these? Is because what's popular amongst Muslims and non-Muslims is this idea, the fighting component of jihad, which of course it exists in Islam, but it's really not the only definition. So is it correct to understand jihad only in its restricted meaning of fighting and abandon the other understandings of jihad, or do we understand it like our scholars have agreed upon, with the different dimensions inclusive of the good deeds that one does? So within the context of the political science and the Islamic relations, oftentimes they say, well, yes, okay, but there can be no peace without justice, and therefore if there is no justice, then jihad is permissible. It's a very simple little statement that one can say. Well, in order to have justice, you have to do jihad. And of course, you know, there are great ramifications to these kinds of statements. So in one of the talks that I had heard him say, he said that it's a pretty dangerous statement because there's really never 100% justice in them. Can you think of one society in the world that has absolute justice? One. So I think that it's just the nature of the abode that we're in. Therefore, we need to work on justice within the construct of peace where possible. Because in peace, many wrongs can be redressed that often cannot be in times of war. So he mentioned this. The changing of the concepts. Now, remember, what I said was, sometimes when something had a specific definition 1,500 years ago, does not mean that that definition might stand still today, or even might stand still a few hundred years after that definition came about. Okay, so basically, you know, there's this terminology where Imam Ahmed and Fadala said, I'll just read the English. Shouldn't I tell you who is the mu'min, the believer? It is whom the people trust with their monies and souls. The Muslim is he who the people are safe from his tongue and hand. And the mujahid is he who strives against himself for the sake of obeying Allah. And the muhajir is he who abandons the bad deeds and sins. Now it's very, very interesting because we know traditionally, if I say to you, what does Islam mean? And then you'll give me the 5 pillars, right? Islam is the Muslim, is somebody who comes into gives the shahada, right? But the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ took a concept that had one meaning and then gave it a new meaning. And this is, by the way, this is from Hijjat al-Wada. He left us with this. So he gave us a new meaning of what Islam is. He gave us a new meaning of what Iman is. He gave us a new meaning of what jihad is, and he gave us a new meaning of what hijrah is. Because even hijrah, it was really addressed in the past. Muhajir was a physical muhajir, one person who migrates from one place to another. But he gave it a new meaning where, you know, basically somebody who migrates from bad actions to good actions. And so terminologies, even here in the really important terminologies, we're not even talking about small little concepts. Even important terminologies, it can change. So basically, let me just get this. So what we are talking about here is what the scholars are talking about here is to having a renewed jurisprudence, which is basically we need a new jurisprudence because times change, circumstances change. And basically we demand to institute new rulings based on our time. It has to be applicable to today. Muftis need to be trained on how to apply legal rulings that are applicable today, and they have to be accommodated with industry experts, and I'm going to get to this in a few minutes. So there are many factors that need to be considered or taken into account that would allow for new jurisprudence to emerge. So these are, Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya talked about this concept of new jurisprudence has to address at the foundational level benefit to society. When you're putting out laws, you have to look at what is the benefit in society, what is the wisdom behind it, how does it apply to rahmah, where is the justice in that, and so and this has to be a question in every ruling that you apply. And also when we look at the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses humanity in the individual responsibility terminology and in the collective responsibility. So we need to be able to distinguish the difference. Sometimes there are certain things, there are certain rulings that are addressed to nations, that are addressed to people, that are addressed to a population, and sometimes there are certain rulings that are addressed to the individual. And we need to be able to distinguish the conditions to understand, are they being addressed to the individual or to the collective? So, what, at the time, right, there were really pretty much three dars that existed, right? You had Dar al-Islam, you had Dar al-Harb, and you had Dar al-Kufr. So, our question is, how do we define what our abode is today? What's our Dar in 2020? Can somebody, the pre-modern categorization obviously no longer fits in the taxonomy of our present day. So it's very important for us to address it's a new abode that we live in, and therefore it necessitates a new categorization of legal rulings. And even at the time of Umar al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, he imposed distribution of land that didn't exist at that time. He imposed taxation on horses because initially even though there's a hadith, a sound sahih hadith that says there's no taxation on horses, trading on horses became a collection, a standing of society. It was a testimony of class. And so he imposed, that no longer became a mode of transportation, it became a luxury, so therefore he imposed taxes on it. He changed things even from, I'm talking about early jurisprudence, examples of changes in early jurisprudence just from the time of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to Umar ibn al-Khattab. He suspended the penal code for theft during famine. And during the Q&A, I'm actually going to share with you a story that I just experienced 2 days ago that applies perfectly well to this. So imagine if we look at our life today and all the dimensions of our lives, right? Whether it's commerce or transactions, loans, family matters, marriage, divorce, health-related matters. Are you going to do a blood transfusion? Is that permissible? Are you, genetic modifications in food? Is that permissible? Social services, public safety, DNA, fingerprinting, things related to mass communications, technology. These are just a few examples. Literally every aspect of life is drastically different. And the jurisprudence of the past cannot carry the problems of our present. So, okay, perfect. Okay, so that's why we have to, but when you turn on the TV or when you listen to scholars, very oftentimes you'll see people giving ifta. So it's very important for you as an individual to understand if this is sound or unsound legal ruling. Sometimes the problem is issued when there's only one mufti. There are many different, in today's day and age, you'd be hard pressed to find one mufti who can issue an ifta by himself, because the world has become so incredibly complicated. So there has to be a dar of ifta, there has to be a group of muftis who can actually come together and have shura between them. So sometimes fatwas are problematic, sometimes the mufti himself is problematic, so these are all important considerations. This is an extremely important slide that I really have to mention because you have to keep certain things in mind when you're talking about ifta. These are just principles that are really important. So first of all, intention is basically, in its totality, underscores everything. Niyyah underscores pretty much everything. I can't really emphasize it enough. That's why Maqasid al-Sharia is actually one of my favorite subjects to learn and to teach. Multiplicity of truths. We assume that there's only one truth. And if one sheikh says one thing, then clearly that could be the only thing. Islam doesn't operate that way. The early schools of jurisprudence disagreed with one another, but believed in this concept. Just because you disagree, you can have fundamental principle, it's called legal pluralism. So you can ascertain, you can use the same sources that we talked about, reach different legal rulings, and believe that Islamically that's actually permissible. You don't have to have one legal ruling that's correct. the mandate to follow the land of the laws of the land is also very important, and this is the most controversial one, because this, in places where there's extreme zulm around the world, case in point, Palestine, this becomes a very problematic subject, but this is something that is constantly debated and talked about in political circles. And then the last one is necessity overrides prohibition, whereby we cannibalism. I mean, I'll take a very obvious. Can you eat human flesh?
Yeah. If there's nothing else to eat.
Precisely, right? So, generally speaking, you're not supposed to, right? But if you're starving to death and you crashed your plane and there's nothing else to eat, you're going to die. You're required to eat it, actually, and it's a sin if you don't. So, in conclusion, I'd just like to say that when we look at the jurisprudence of reality, what we have to see is these are the questions that we have to ask. Now, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya addressed these. Other scholars have talked about these as well in support. So you have to look at what's the essence of the thing? Anything that you want to talk about. Why? You have to ask the question why. What's the reasoning behind it? How do we apply it? Consider the time frame. Are we in a time of war? Are we in a time of famine? Are we in winter? Is it cold? Is it hot? Where are we? What parts of the world is it? Is there an earthquake? Is there water? Is there no water? And who are the people who are actually issuing these rulings is an extremely critical aspect. And so there are some legal case studies, if you can consider, and I have only 2 more slides and I'm done. So basically, if you can think of there are a million different examples I can put out here, but imagine the female witnesses. Imagine if you go to Angela Merkel today and you say to her, actually, thank you very much, but you're a woman, and so therefore your opinion is only half of that of a man. I mean, it sounds pretty laughable, to be honest with you, right? So there has to be, and every single one of these is a juristic conversation that you can have, issues relating, and these are all conversations that are being had today. Is what circumstances are abortion, apostasy? Do I really kill somebody because he is no longer a Muslim? In our world today, can you do that? Can you justifiably go kill a person who chose to leave Islam, for example? And there are a million different examples as to how old jurisprudence cannot apply to modern day problems. And so this idea of renovation, and I don't usually like to call it reform. Some modernists call it reform. I don't call it reform because reform is a sort of has pejorative connotations that assume that there's something wrong with Islam that needs to be reformed. A renovation is a softer word that basically says it needs to be renovated. You have like a kitchen that or something that needs to have new pipings in them, etc. There's nothing wrong with the original one, but you just have to update it effectively, and you build on it, and there's a new one. So last but not least, there needs to be a present day fatwa councils. Every single society needs a fatwa council. And when I say society, I don't mean the fatwa council in Yemen should dictate what happens to Muslim Americans in California. Or the fatwa society in Tataristan, China, should dictate what happens to Turkish people in Gaziantep. Right? Every society has its own circumstances, and this is how it was traditionally. Sharia, like I said, was highly decentralized. It was societally based. Because if we talk about reality, right? My reality is very different than the brother's reality, Brother Muhammad, who just came here from Gaza 11 months ago and spent 11 years in prison, right? And he just came to Turkey. Is my reality the same as his? Of course not. Right? Are the realities of the people who are living in Gaza the same as the realities of the people living in Istanbul? So then we have to have various jurisprudences that apply to the people in the different realities, and it has to include muftis alone in today's day and age can never have authority or should never have authority to issue iftas on their own. They have to consult with lawyers, they have to consult with content experts, with industry advisors, with economic analysts. It has to be a body of knowledge that complements one another. And depending on what the subject is, you have to be able to have a compilation of all of these things so that rulings can be can match the reality of our time. And أقول قولي هذا, and I thank you for your time, and I'm open to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Yasemin. I think this is very, very good, very interesting point. I get to know personally, about fiqh al-waqa like 3 years ago or 4 years ago. I read about bimetric lightly on fiqh al-waqa, which is a really good book. And then I start to understand what that means. For example, even if you read a classical Islamic thinker, you will also get to know the idea of fiqh al-waqa. It's already embedded in the text of the classical Muslim scholar, and I would like to mention, for example, Mawardi asked the question, if we have kind of election and we have 2 candidates to be the leader, the imam, which one should we select? If they have the same character, the same attitude for everything, but one has more knowledge and one has more more brave. So he said, based on the time we decide. If we have a war, if we have conflicts, we will decide for the who is brave, because we need people like a brave leader to lead the nation. But if we have peace and safety, we need to go for the one who has more knowledge, because it's more important. So it's always, if you read a classical text, there's no one-way direction. It's also, we need always to think about the time, and this is, I think, also a big problem with such Al-Qaeda, for example, when they analyze the concept of jihad. They go to specific texts, they cut them from the context, and they're trying to analyze the concept of jihad in the modern time based on specific text written 1,000 years ago or something like this. That's why fiqh al-waqa is interesting and very important also. So now I will open the floor for you for questions or comments. No question? Yes, Lynn.
That was either very clear or very boring.
Yes, Lynn.
Yeah, so thank you very much. And if I understood correctly, you are going to stay here for a semester at Adaptability, or?
Inshallah, I mean, as a start. So Dr. Sami and I will hopefully, we're trying to do something more long term, but for now I'm here for a semester. Inshallah.
Okay, all right. I think it would be very interesting if you could give another lecture on the issue of adoption in Islam, because you sort of got us very interested in the beginning, but then unfortunately we didn't hear too much about it. So I don't know if we can arrange that, because that would be a very specific topic, and especially in the times of war where there are so many orphans.
So I have to tell you, I've given that talk a few times, and half the room has always fallen asleep. And the only reason I don't consider myself a very boring speaker, but the topic is extremely technical, and unless you really care about Islamic adoption or adoption in general, most people unfortunately don't care, which is very sad, because it's one of the most important things you can, actually it is the most important thing you can do, because there's nothing else, if you look at the entire sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, there's nothing else that he said, if you do this, you will be like this with me in the hereafter. Nothing else, except for taking care of me. You know, it's what I call the neglected sunnah. So it's something that's very deeply personal to me and to my life and my heart. I'm a huge advocate for it. But I've noticed that. But I mean, I'm happy to. If people are interested, I'm happy to walk through my presentation and happy to give it. So.
And then I have follow-up questions though. Yeah, but on another topic. On the local fatwa council.
It's nice you say follow-up, but then it's different.
Yes. Yeah.
Local fatwa council.
No, first I wanted to just express my interest for her actual PhD topic. So, I would be interested to know more about, like, have you studied the different fatwa or local fatwa councils that are currently working in Europe?
I have, a little bit.
Yes, a little.
I've studied one, I actually visited one in UK.
Yes.
I've studied the one that was newly instituted in the United Arab Emirates because I lived there for quite a while. And there was one in Texas
Yeah.
that I studied. Now, there are a few wonderful attempts at this, but I think that they're highly deficient in their on so many different levels. So I'm happy to get into why I think they're deficient, but okay. So for example, and I'm not I don't mean to sound like a feminist when I say this, but women scholars bring a different perspective to the conversation. And there is hardly ever any female scholarship in the fatwa councils. That's one problem. Another problem is you go to fatwa councils and you see muftis. Muftis are not content experts. If I want to talk about genetic mutation and what is permissible and what is not in a chicken to genetically modify a chicken, I need to be able to talk about, to bring to the conversation content experts. If I'm going to do a heart transplant or a lung transplant or a liver transplant or whatever it might be, then we need to be able to address those issues from the medical, environmental, political. If we're going to have conversations, it's very easy to say suicide bombing is haram, for example. And of course, one can very easily infer that conclusion. But what do you do in society? And I'm not, I'm not a politician, or I don't have the authority to make conclusions about any of these subjects. But the idea is you have to be able to have content experts have this discussion, and muftis alone cannot do that. And also there has to be, even within muftis, there has to be specialized muftis. Today, the sciences of Islam has expanded so much that it is impossible for one mufti to really have complete knowledge of everything. Even some of the giants of our time would, by self-admission, say that. That is why وَأَمْرُكُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَكُمْ. And you have to have, if the Prophet ﷺ consulted his own Sahaba at the time, we have to be able to do the same. So this fatwa council is a very sophisticated space. The other aspect of it is that legal rulings cannot be imposed on the population. You can't conclusively say, well, we have deemed that this is haram, and therefore it is legal, it is mandated. Unless you live in a society, you can't do that in England, for example, right? You can issue a fatwa on something, but then you can't, it doesn't become law in the United Kingdom. It basically applies to only those who want it to apply to. There's no compulsion. The concept of no compulsion really applies to everybody. A Muslim is willing. It's basically it's a voluntary accepted thing. You don't have to accept it if you don't want to. And legal rulings also need to be constantly amendable. Just because you have a fatwa today doesn't mean that fatwa has to stand the test of time. Fatwas have to be constantly amendable, just like the early scholars. It's one of those reasons why I had to go and give an introduction about Islamic law, because without understanding Islamic law, it's really hard for anybody to understand how a fatwa council needs to be like. I mean, I think they're wonderful attempts. I think that they leave a lot to be desired.
Okay, Yumpa, please.
Thanks for your speech. Really, it was much interesting for me. I have one story. It's not a question, it's a comment for this last slide. I remember from a story someone told before to me about Umar ibn Khattab, and one of those, he was not Muslim, came and asked him about that. You claim that religion, or mainly Quran, contain everything and have any information I would ask, it would be there in Quran. So he said yes. So he take him and bring him like a bag of, I think it was wheat, and he told him how many breads can be produced from this. So he take him to a baker and he asked him how many breads can be produced from this. He said, yeah, this number. So he told him, no, I'm asking you to answer me from Quran. So he told him like, اسألوا أهل الذكر إن كنتم لا تعلمون. So at that time that this guy turned to be Muslim and all this, but when I think about this story, I feel like this last slide is only about اسألوا أهل الذكر إن كنتم لا تعلمون. Fatwa should be including all those who, and أهل الذكر is not like those who say tasbih or whatever. Dhikr is here is ilm, yani, like those who know,
Exactly.
knowing at least. So I feel like it's exactly the same this story. Maybe the one who was telling me this story was not trying to prove this. He was trying to tell me that everything is in the Quran. But from another perspective, I believe totally that this kind of comprehensive view of Islam should be including all these kind of experts for the purpose of fatwa.
Yes, absolutely, and I'm really glad you brought this up because I just have a really good comment to make about that. We oftentimes confuse Sharia with the Quran. Quran is constant. It stands the test of time. Sharia is not. Sharia and Islamic law and jurisprudence has to be constantly amendable with the changing of the times. We have made the colossal error of making Sharia static. And that therein lies the big problem. It's actually one of the reasons why I wanted to study fiqh, is because I really was trying to understand where this disconnect is coming from. Why so many youth are leaving Islam today, because they find it unlivable.
Yeah.
So it's heartbreaking, and so I just wanted to really try to understanding. And I have to tell you, the more I study fiqh, the more liberal I become. I mean, because I find that it's so incredibly inclusive, open, and it's a beautiful body of science that I highly recommend all of you.
Yeah, I totally believe that this kind of paradigm, if it's applied everywhere in our Muslim countries, it will make like Islam and Muslim countries totally different.
Yeah.
In terms of everything.
I think so.
Yes, I know.
Thank you, Dr. for your presentation. When I was listening to your presentation, trying to link, particularly this last slide when you were talking about the reality of Islam, for instance, you gave the example of the women, the liberal women, and so forth. I felt like we are not dealing with deen. I felt like we are dealing with policy. And because deen is something timing that people must obey things. My question here, and what I'm saying that because sometimes if we take like very easy, in easy way, that could harm the religion itself. Now we are talking in fact that some fatwa is created to touch what we call the usul. For instance, I can refer you, for instance, to the book of Adaptability, 17th century. In the North Africa, you can start, for instance, from the Khawarij dynasty, after the Muwahidin dynasty, those who were responsible behind the confluence of Malaysia. You find one of the books, which is chaotic book in Islam, you find how they don't fatwa till they get out of the religion and start worshipping people. The second thing in terms of application, and also when I used to go through this, that the door of Ijtihad is closed, don't you think that it is better for the door of Ijtihad to be closed, particularly when in a world where the state of nation is the main player in the world? And you have seen recently that many religious councils belong to the system, not to the religion itself.
I think that it is extremely harmful for the door of Ijtihad to be closed, and that's not really, my opinion. I from my understanding of my tradition and what the Quran and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks from us is to constantly contemplate. and to think and to factor and to make evaluations that are indicative of circumstance. Surely that's also in the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad and the Sahaba that came after him, and the jurists that came after them as well. Just like the examples that I gave you, I mean, even the jurists that we follow, they themselves were mujtahidun within their own lifetime. So I believe that just as we as human beings are progressing, our deen needs to progress with us. We oftentimes are because we're so worried. Actually, part of the problem, I have to say, historically and politically, is because colonialism has greatly impacted, and that's another topic that's more political that we can discuss. Wa al-Halaq is a very famous political scientist who talks about this, how colonialism has greatly impacted Islamic law in so many different parts of the world, including in North Africa and the Middle East and then British India and so on and so forth. And he gave many different case studies. Why I bring this up is because it is incumbent on us to say, you know what, we determine our own destiny. And regardless of what has happened in the past, we're moving forward. And our deen has to be commensurate with the time that we're in, regardless of, so being protectionist is a result of colonialism. Is a direct result of colonialism. But being protectionist can also be very harmful if we're not careful. And so that is why I believe that these fatwa councils all around the world need to emerge so that we could really live a present-day version of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would like from us.
First of all, thank you for your excellent presentation. This topic is one of my favorite topics, Maqasid Sharia. Since I read the book of Adaptability, it's years, 10 years, 11 years. السياسة الشرعية بين نصوص الشريعة ومقاصد الحق. It's very interesting.
It is.
He referred to Ibn al-Qayyim and Ibn Taymiyyah and fiqh al-awlawiyat. This mentioned the fiqh of priorities.
Yes.
So, yes, I'm agree with you in lots of things here, but I would like to raise some problems just to provoke the.
Sure.
Yes.
Let's talk about it. That's great.
The main question here, or the main problem, the problem of interpretation. Yes, and the modernist reading of text. You know, as for example, Ali Harab mentioned in one of his books, I think, The Illusion of Reading. There are three main levels of when you're dealing with text. I mean, Quran or Sunnah text: explanation, and interpretation, and then the constructivist way of dealing with it. So each one of these levels bring like a new schools, or refer to one of schools now, al-Nasriyun, for example, Persians, or al-Maqasidiyun, for example, who refer to yes. And the most here, the problem here is in the third level, the constructivist way of reading texts, and which bring what we call now the modernist school. For example, I can mention a lot of scholars in Algeria, for example, Muhammad Al-Ghul, yes, in Egypt, for example, Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid, or in Morocco, or in lots of you know the problem. So, my question here, did you consider this kind of ijtihad as ijtihad or not for you? And this is it a new way of dealing with text or not?
Right.
Yeah, this is the first question. The second one, who is Adam? My colleague mentioned Deepen. But when we try to define who is Adam now, so this is bring us to another problem. To the problem of tajrih. Because amongst aliens, you know, there is some standards. Who make these standards of alien? And you mentioned very good points here, the contribution of many different fields of research. For example, in politics, can I, as for example, as a scientist in this political science, to make contribution in fatwa or not? This is the...
Yes.
And I have a lot of questions, but the main question is about the modernist.
Okay, so thank you so much for asking that question. So I was born and raised in Saudi Arabia, and I studied in Islamic schools in Saudi Arabia, and that's pretty much a very Nassi way of interpreting Islam. When I did my master's in Islamic theology, I was very attracted to tasawwuf. And that is a very maqasidi form of understanding Islam. If I had to, and I don't label, sometimes, you know, pigeonhole us, but I find that constructivism as a means of understanding Islam is a very healthy place to be in 2020, is what you're talking about.
The constructivist.
Yes, the constructivist way, because our life has become so complicated that you have to, it is like a construction, right? You're building a house, you have to have your tiler, your plumber, your roofer, your interior architect, exterior architect, right? So we have the aqidah is the same, but jurisprudence has become a lot more complex in the daily dealings of our lives. So it is I find that the constructivist methodology, and maybe is that what you mean?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, you are talking about the structuralist, but I'm talking about the constructivist.
Oh, deconstructivist.
Yes.
Okay.
Jacques Derrida, for example.
Oh, I see.
When
Okay.
we deal with text, what does
I'm
it
sorry.
mean?
Yes.
For example,
yes.
if I write a text here, the text is not mine now.
Yes,
I
yes.
cannot make the interpretation. The
Yes.
interpretation is referred to you, to
Yes,
others.
yes.
Yes. It means there is no central meaning of texts.
Correct.
This is what does mean the constructivist.
Right,
There is no
yes.
meaning.
Right.
Center of this of this text. This is make very deep problem in when we dealing with texts, and this is what bring the al-madrasa al-hadathiyya in, for example, like Arcon's writings or others. This is what and do you consider as ijtihad or not? This is my point.
Oh, I see. You know, deconstructivism, I see it as a supplemental component of the ijtihadiyya. It can't stand on its own because it's not sufficient. It's not kamil in its fragmentation, but it can definitely, a deconstructivist, for example, in a fatwa council would work because they're not alone in their understanding or in their contribution to whatever it is the subject of the fatwa that they're trying to issue. Does that make sense? Perhaps?
Yes, maybe.
Maybe, you know, sometimes when we're talking about concepts as concepts, there, you know, if we give a practical example, okay, I'll give you a practical example. Let's look. So I just came back from Pakistan yesterday, and I'll conclude. Well, maybe no, we still have about 15. Okay, so I'll give you an example. I was in Pakistan for the past 4 days on a mini vacation / charity work. I was in this town called Nankana Sahib. It's a small village outside of Lahore, about an hour and a half away from Lahore. A friend of mine has a farmhouse over there. And one day, 2 days ago, I woke up one morning and I found out that I have 2 cell phones, and I found out that this cell phone, doesn't matter, which was right next to my bed, and I know because I had used it the night before. I was working on this presentation actually in the dark at night while my son is sleeping next to me. And I was using the flashlight to see the keyboard, so I put it next to me. Anyway, I woke up in the morning and the phone was not there. So, of course, I didn't want to accuse anybody. The door was locked, etc. Anyway, long story short, You know, it was an iPhone, so from this iPhone I was able to track the other iPhone, the location of it. SubhanAllah, talk about technology. It was actually in the middle of the farmland. Literally, it was on a scavenger hunt. It was me, my son, her children, the grandmother. We're all like following this phone to find my other phone. And we found out that somebody had stolen it. How they stole it is a long story. But the point is that one of the farmers had stolen the phone, put it in a bag, dug a hole in the ground, hid it, and put some fresh leaves on it because I guess he wanted to come back at night and take it home or whatnot. Now, can you imagine for a minute? We basically go to this farmer. Let me give you the circumstances. This village is incredibly poor. This man is entirely illiterate. He's Muslim technically. If I asked him for what are the 5 pillars of Islam, he could probably hardly tell me the first 3, let alone apply it. He's bonded to this land, which basically is another form of modern day slavery. He has 4 children at home who, this man lives on $30 a month wages. Now, could you imagine me applying the fiqh of I need to cut your hand for stealing my phone? So much that the bone actually needs to stick out of it so that the whole world knows that you're a thief. Now, so, that's a question. Would that question apply to this man? Could we say that justifiably we need to take that sharia and we need to cut his hand because he stole my phone? So it's not that simple. We have to apply, and this goes back to Umar al-Khattab when there was famine. He removed the penal code. Of course, obviously, I forgave the man. It was fine. Everything was okay. You have to have intention. You have to have compassion. You have to have understanding. You have to, you have to be able to deconstruct what is happening in that village, in that society. The circumstances of the man, his earnings, his knowledge about Islam, right? His temptations. I shouldn't have kept the phone out, for example, maybe. So all of these things, you have to be able to take verses and take legal rulings and be able to reevaluate them within the context of your own circumstance. So I don't know if that helped. That story maybe it helped.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's illuminating. I have 3 points to make. I'm going to start from the last one, which is the question of Sharia. What is permanent and what is changing? Because I think there's a lot of point now to make what is permanent changing. Because even if we go to some of the texts within the Quran, there's some people, some very scholars that I respect very much, would like to make these things as changeable. And I think there is a need to define what the red lines are. On the question, for example, of inheritance laws, where a lot of people think mistakenly that a woman from every time she gets half of what the man gets, which is not the case. In certain cases, the mother will get more than the father. In certain instances, she will get half. But I think about 6 out of 11 times she gets more. But whatever it is, I think there is the lack of knowledge, but also we need to know what is changeable and what is not. And what the is very much a different thing. But also the question of theft. You mentioned the case about someone who stole your phone, but if you go and actually look at the case law, it is like, yes, you cut his hand, but what are the conditions? There are about 12 or 13 conditions. And I'm sure if I go and look at this man, he probably wouldn't have had 8 or 9 of them applied. You have to have all these conditions. You should have passed muster before you can even think about applying it. And even after all that is done, the judge could still rule against it for a different reason. Maybe he's not competent, he's just, many other things, and intentions in certain cases. The other point I want to make has to do with the nation state. Because, again, if you go to the argument by Allah and possible state, and we try to apply Sharia as it exists today, and it's interesting that one of the points you make at the end was that we would like to make this as a state law, so that it could be applied, and it could be respected, and becomes equally used. But that concept by itself is the concept of the modern state, that everybody has to be equal before the law. But in Islamic history, you may have different ones. And you start by saying the multiplicity and the plural of interpretations. So I may not have to, I mean, obviously there are certain things I can't change because this is the Quran established. But I may not want to, be ruled by someone's opinion because somehow the majority of the people, 51%, think that this is the way it should be. Perhaps we need to distinguish this a little further and see what are the things by which everybody has to apply to, because there is a larger principle. And what are the things are as a matter of faith that you cannot compel me to apply, because as a matter of faith I don't believe in it. And I think the whole Sharia is about faith. Therefore, I was advocating, and I haven't developed a theory yet, but something like, the problem that we have today between, let's say, what people call for what they call civil society and those who like to apply Sharia. On one hand, those who like civil society, they oppose Sharia and they think themselves as citizens of the country. Those who want to apply Sharia, those who want to apply Sharia, I think it's a matter of faith. I want to do that. Even if I steal, I want to cut my hand because this is how I feel. Now, if you go, for instance, on the issue of hudud, the whole issue of hudud is not just to deter society, but there's a larger concept that has to do with the after, with the hereafter. Is that particular sin, not just a crime, but a sin, by the time, if you get punished in this life, that's it. You're not going to be asked for it in the hereafter. So if someone commits, let's say, zina, and is supposed to get 100 lashes, and now they don't get 100 lashes. But if you give him that choice, he said, I want to take 100 lashes because I don't want to come in the day of judgment. I mean, if it's called, being asked about it. So here is where you may have different laws. You can allow the judge, he said, would you like to be judged by Muslim law or Sharia law, or you can be judged by state law. State law, you're going to go 2 years in prison, or you get 100 lashes. In other words, you allow for actually it happens in the US. The judge who has somebody, they can give him a range, let's say 2 to 5 years, or they can, or fine, or without fine, or end. I mean, there are a range of things. So I think this is one way to deal with this. Third point I'm trying to make is, I'm sure you've read the book that came in 2007. It's called Building Moderate Muslim Networks. It's a book that looks at Muslims and society, especially after the West became very interested in Islam and Muslims after 9/11. And they say there are about 5 different categories we can look at Muslims with their societies. There are the extremists and the radicals. We have the conservatives. We have the moderates. And then they define what each means really. And then we have the liberals and modernists, and we have the secular. This book was written by an anthropologist, a historian, a political scientist, and sociologist. It was a study commissioned by RAND. RAND is very obviously part of the security establishment in the US. And they were trying to get these 4 scholars to recommend exactly how to deal with Muslims, whether in Western societies or at large. And they said, obviously our preference is to have the secular Muslim, the one who doesn't care about religion, because religion is very dangerous. But that's not attainable. Second is try to get the liberal, the total liberal, who probably doesn't even care. He said, well, that's preferred, obviously, but it's probably not achievable, so we need to concentrate on the moderate. And then they try to define what a moderate is. And part of that, they focus on the question of jihad. My fear somebody like Abdullah bin Bayya, some of these scholars, is that they have, whether knowingly or unknowingly, bought into this thing in order to reach what the British were trying to reach in the Indian subcontinent under colonization, with these different groups that they created, so that they can isolate and try to basically obliterate the concept of jihad to the point where it becomes totally meaningless. So my, jihad has a role. We can discuss the whole thing. This is not the time for it. It has a role in defending your rights and defending yourself, as well as obviously to have the ability to bring Islam. But that's the first part, which I think is probably inoperable. But at least in terms of defending yourself, there's a. So the question here is, do you see any danger that trying to reinterpret some of the basic concepts in Islam, things that have been established and they do have context, it's not out of context, in order to achieve political needs, political ends, and whether scholars, established scholars like Bin Bayya and others, have been used. I don't want to accuse them of anything. In order to achieve that goal, when Obama praises Bin Bayya, I become suspicious. When he says, we're doing, because I know how American policy works and what exactly they're trying to achieve. So that makes me a little bit wary of where this is going and why it's.
Sure. So I have studied with Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, as how I have with scores of other scholars for quite a number of years. He is very well aware of the international scrutiny that he has been getting to his face and behind his, and by other circles, for example, engaging in this peace forum that he created, engaging in the political, with political figures in the United Arab Emirates, for example, who, you can argue are just or unjust and have been doing a lot of injustices, etc. So I'm not here to defend him. My personal, but I'll just share a snippet in response to what you're saying, and you may accept it or not. For me personally, I take what I learn from all scholars, and there's not one scholar that I agree with on 100%. I think that our religion dictates that you offer bay'ah to the Rasul and everybody else, you learn from them, and you judge them within the context of their own limitations, right? Abdullah bin Bayya is a scholar from Mauritania who lives in Saudi Arabia, and he's pushing 90, and he has his own perspective on things, right? So within the context of, but he basically makes the argument of, yes, there is intense amount of dhulm in Muslim lands, and yes, these intense amount of dhulm in Muslim lands are imposed by Western philosophy. His position on peace, not war, is, or at least he argues it, is derived from Islamic foundations. It's not that he is has bought what they say, the Kool-Aid of some other government. But Allahu A'lam, I haven't opened his heart and looked inside, but I can only go by what he has said, because he does get criticized a lot. How can you side with these governments? How can you negotiate? He will tell you. He said, you know what? Even with your enemy, even at the time of Quraysh and with the Jews and with a lot of people, if you look at the Charter of Medina, you can still make alliances with Mushrikun. You can make alliances with Yahud. You can make alliances with Quraysh, right? They made the alliances with all these people. You can still engage in conversation, make alliances with people who are presumably your enemies. So he says, I just, by virtue of the fact that I'm in conversation with certain political figures or regimes or governments that may impose an injustice, does not mean that I support their injustice. It means that there is some room for us to discuss, because I believe that the position of war, the preservation of life for him is sacred. So the preservation of life is much more important than the preservation of land. So he says, let's negotiate, let's have peace, and then let's negotiate whatever injustices that there are to negotiate. And that's his position, and he's maintained that position for many years. Wallahu a'lam. You know, he just believes that peace and sacredness of life is above all. So, Allahu a'lam.
Okay. Dr. Yasemin will stay with us in CIGA, so if you have a question, you can ask her later. Thank you very much. We enjoyed this. Maybe we can organize also for what Linda request for the CIGA Student Society. It will be a really good idea, I think.
For students.
Yeah, for CIGA Student Society.
You know what?
We can
I don't mind if
organize
it's 2 students. I don't mind if it's just you and me.
Yes.
I have no problem. You know, alhamdulillah, it's my passion, and whoever's interested in hearing about it, you know, I'm happy to talk about.
Now, Dr. Saib will present for you.
Oh my God, that's so nice. Thank you so much. Is that your phone?
No.
Oh, can you send that to me? Oh, okay. Thank you so much. This is beautiful.
You can have it.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.